I'm Dr. David Bernstein. Welcome back to our series, 25 Tips for Working with Modes. Now, last time we talked about how to investigate somebody's modes, how to carry out the assessment process, and how to gather information from multiple sources in order to try to piece together a kind of a picture of someone, and using the modes as a central organizing concept in order to do that. Now today we're going to go a step further. We're going to talk about how to create a visual representation of somebody's modes based on that assessment process called a mode map. And that leads us to the topic for today, Map It. Now, why do we want to create this kind of visual representation? Because it's very clarifying. It's a kind of blueprint, you could say, of somebody's modes. If you want to see how a house is put together, you can just look at a blueprint and you can see it. And it's exactly the same thing with a mode map. So, we want to see how somebody fits together, and you can imagine that that blueprint, that mode map could be very useful for you as a treatment provider, it could be useful for the patient, and it could also be useful for your colleagues. Let's say in a multidisciplinary team and you want to share the mode map of a patient with your colleagues so that everybody can kind of be on the same page. Now, in order to make a mode map, you need to know something about different types or categories of modes. And we've touched upon this briefly, but I'll just go over it again just for sake of clarity. There are four basic types of modes: child modes, inner critic modes, coping modes, and healthy modes. And the child modes are the modes that have to do with basic emotions like sadness or fear or anger or shame. So these are modes like the abandoned child mode, or let's say the lonely child mode or the angry child mode. And when people are in child modes, they experience their emotions, particularly painful or vulnerable emotions, directly. The second type of modes are the inner critic modes. Those are the modes that have to do with self-directed criticism or self-directed pressure. So these are based upon, you could say, messages that we get growing up, messages that we've internalized and then we direct toward ourselves. So it's a kind of voice in our heads telling us that we're no good or that we're not doing things well enough and so forth. The third category of modes are the so-called coping modes. And these are the modes that people use to cope with their emotional pain or, with their, the areas in their lives in which they didn't get their needs met sufficiently. And so, for example, there are modes that have to do with the use of avoidance, like the detached protector mode, modes that have to do with overcompensation, or what I like to call taking the one-up position, like the self-aggrandizer mode, and modes that have to do with surrendering or taking the one-down position, like the compliant surrenderer mode. And finally, there are the healthy modes, the healthy adult mode and the happy playful child mode. And the healthy adult mode is the mode that helps us to take care of ourselves, to make good choices, to be in touch with our emotions, to communicate with others, to take care of our emotional needs. And the playful, happy child mode is the mode that in which we can experience, joy and pleasure in things. Okay, so now imagine that you've gone through an assessment process like we described last time, and you want to create a mode map. What you want to think about are, what are the specific modes that you saw during that assessment process, and then you want to kind of sort them into these categories, and you want to do that by putting them into this map. And this is one way in which you can organize a mode map. Different people have come up with different ones. This is one that I came up with Arnoud Arntz years ago, and I've kind of refined it a little bit. I'm not going to go through all the details at this moment because in a second I'm going to present a case and show you how we use this. But basically, what you see is that in circles or rectangles, you have different types of modes. And typically the way you do this is you'd have a kind of template like this, and depending on which modes you came across in the assessment process, you would write them in different places in this diagram. So for example, the child modes you put in the lower right, the inner critic modes, the upper right, and then the modes on the left-hand side of the diagram are all of the coping modes. Any kind of avoidant coping modes you'd put in the middle, overcompensating coping modes on the upper left, surrendering modes on the lower left, and healthy modes on top. Okay, so you gather that information, and depending on which modes you found, put them in the right place. Now, why is this helpful? First of all, because you can see all of a person's modes in one picture. Number two, you can look at mode dynamics. So for example, let's take an example of overcompensation. Let's say somebody, has a side of themselves, where they can feel a lot of shame and inferiority. Well, that's called the inferior child mode. And what you would do is you would write that mode under the child modes. But people cope with that mode in different ways. Let's say somebody copes by overcompensating and develops a self-aggrandizer mode. That would go on the upper left. And now imagine that you were showing this diagram to a patient. Well, it becomes much easier for you to explain to them and for them to grasp their mode dynamics. For the first time, they may realize, like, oh my God, that's why I have this tendency to put myself above other people, because there's another side of myself which I see over on the right, where I feel that I'm beneath other people. Okay? Now, generally speaking, the modes that are on the right-hand side represent the kinds of modes where people are more likely to feel their inner pain, and the modes that are on the left-hand side are more the modes where people try to get away from their inner pain. And so the modes on the left are all the so-called coping modes. Now, I've come up with some alternative names for some of the modes. For example, I refer to coping modes as bodyguard modes. And the reason is because that might be a more accessible way for some patients to understand the function of those modes. That all of those coping modes, whether they involve avoidance, overcompensation, or surrendering, involve forms of self-protection. And furthermore, I tend to use the term one-up modes instead of overcompensating, and one-down modes instead of surrendering, because again, I think they're more intuitive for patients. And furthermore, within the child modes, I tend to use the term pain point modes for the vulnerable child modes, because when you touch on somebody's emotional wounds, it causes pain. And for the angry and impulsive child modes, I refer to them as the fast and furious modes, okay, also within the child modes. Okay, so this is one way to take that information that you gathered and put it into visual form. Now let's take an example. Let's go back to the example of last time in the case of Ron. Now here you see something extra. The something extra that you see are the images from the eye modes. Because with the eye modes, you can bring another element to making a mode map, and that is using the cards and positioning the cards in places that correspond to different types of modes. So imagine that you've met with Ron several times, you've gone through this whole process, and now you want to present his mode map. Well, you can do it the traditional way where you're going to write the names in the different places, but you can then take the cards and position them in different locations here, let's say on the table, so that he can see those same modes that he's been working with, but all together, all of his modes, in visual form in one place, and understand more of how they work. So we describe, we talked about how, Ron experienced abandonment growing up, right? His father, his parents divorced and he rarely saw his father, so that's his main pain point mode is over there on the lower right, among the child modes. We also talked about the fact that Ron developed different ways of coping, right, with his emotional pain. For example, one way is to escape his pain through self-soothing, right, by the detached self-soother mode there in the middle. So again, immediately if you're working with Ron, he can see how his detached self-soother mode relates to and helps, in a sense, or protects his abandoned child mode. And furthermore, we talked about that, Ron gets into these conflicts with his girlfriend, right? Where, on the one hand, when he wants to get out, he wants to escape, essentially. He on the one hand, he has his attachment needs, right? He wants to be close to his girlfriend, and some of them, that desire for attachment is just normal need for attachment. Some of it is a kind of desperate need for closeness coming out of that abandoned child mode. But at the same time, he also, is very, very frightened of intimacy because of some of his early experiences. And you remember that when he and his girlfriend get into conflict, it's when he wants to get out wants to go out and be with his friends. And there he goes into his angry child mode, and then immediately goes to the one-up position, attacking her. Right there you see the bullying attack mode on the left, the upper left. And then he feels terribly guilty, and you see now his inner critic mode, the critical parent mode on the upper right. And then he takes the one down position. You see there on the lower left, that he goes into a compliant surrender mode and tries to please her. And finally he moves to that lower middle position where you see he's again in an avoidant coping mode, in a kind of bodyguard mode, the angry protector mode. Okay, and fortunately he also has a healthy adult mode where you can talk to him and engage him in this kind of discussion. He can reflect upon himself and get more in touch with his feelings. Okay, so you can imagine then, if you've done the assessment process with Ron, you take out your mode map. You could have literally a template there, and then you can put the cards, superimpose the cards on the template on a sheet of paper, or you can simply use the cards alone and position them in roughly the same positions that you see here. And for somebody like Ron, you can imagine that this could be very, very clarifying. Okay, so you just learned how to make a mode map, and you can imagine then that it'd be very useful in the process of, feeding this information back to the patient. Suddenly he can see in visual form, how he's put together, how his mode dynamics work, and that you can also share this information with the team. Now, where do we go from here? Well, a couple of times in this course, I've mentioned the fact that you can do a case conceptualization, in terms of people's modes or in different or in terms of schemas. And sometimes in schema therapy we work with modes, and sometimes we work with schemas, and sometimes we work with both. But I haven't really told you, when and how. So that's going to be the topic of our video for next time. When might we want to use schemas? When might we want to use modes, or to combine them? And so that's going to be the topic of our next video. Choose it. And finally, I want to invite you to come to our website, www.imodes.com, and look at our image-based therapy tools. Have a great week, and see you next time.